My name is Paige. I am 34 years old, and my father just stood in front of 300 elite military families to loudly announce that I was a worthless college dropout. I stood there in my simple gray pantsuit, letting him humiliate me, while my mother shoved a cheap plastic ticket into my chest and ordered me to hide in the back row so I would not ruin their perfect family photos. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They had no idea that the four-star general walking toward the podium was about to expose my carefully guarded secret, and that within hours, my father would be the one begging for my mercy. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe, and hung if you have ever had to watch toxic family members dig their own graves. The salty breeze off the Pacific Ocean whipped across the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. It was a flawless California morning, the kind of day designed for celebrations and high honors. Crisp white uniforms blinded the eye in the bright sunlight. Proud families clustered in groups adjusting ties and wiping away happy tears. I stepped out of my rental car and smoothed down the jacket of my tailored but deliberately understated gray pantsuit. I had not come to make a scene. I had come to witness my brother complete one of the most grueling military training programs on Earth. But in my family, peace was never an option. I barely had time to close my car door before my father intercepted me. Edward did not offer a hug or a smile of greeting. He marched across the asphalt with his chest puffed out, wearing a suit that cost more than a car, his face already twisted in a sneer. He stopped 2 feet away from me, invading my personal space just enough to establish dominance. "Who invited the dropout?" he snapped. His voice was not a whisper. It was loud enough to make a nearby family of a newly minted officer turn and stare. I kept my expression entirely neutral. "I received an invitation in the mail, Edward. I assumed you and Mom sent it. I would never invite a failure to a day like this." He laughed bitterly. "This day is about your brother. It is about honor and discipline and pushing past your limits. Things you know absolutely nothing about." He gestured wildly around the base, pointing to the flags and the military hardware on display. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Paige. 14 years ago, you shamed this entire family when you washed out of Annapolis. You could not even handle basic physical conditioning. You quit and ran away. And now you show up in your boring corporate clothes to try to steal some of your brother's glory." I looked him dead in the eye. I did not monologue about my past. I did not raise my voice to match his theatrics. I simply stated the facts. I did not wash out Edward. I was reassigned. My father threw his head back and laughed loudly, a booming theatrical sound designed to draw even more attention. "Reassigned," he mocked. "That is a nice corporate word for giving up. You sat at a desk because you could not hack it in the field. Reassigned to a cubicle because you were too weak to bleed. Real warriors bleed, Paige. Your brother bleeds. He is out there doing the real work while you push papers and pretend your life has meaning." Before I could respond, my mother rushed over. Patricia was teetering on expensive heels, her hair sprayed into a rigid helmet of blonde waves. I thought for a brief, foolish second that she might tell my father to lower his voice. Instead, she grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the other families. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her fingers digging painfully into my sleeve. "You are going to ruin everything. Your father has important defense contractors attending this ceremony today. People who buy from his company. We cannot have them asking questions about the daughter who could not finish the academy." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. "I am here to support my brother, that is all." Patricia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a flimsy piece of blue paper. She aggressively shoved it directly into my chest. "Take it," she ordered. I looked down at the ticket. It was a general admission pass, the kind handed out to distant acquaintances and overflow guests. It designated a seat in the very last row of the unshaded bleachers, far away from the VIP pavilion, where the families of the graduates were supposed to sit. "You will sit in the back," Patricia commanded. "You will not come down to the front. You will not try to get in the family photos. You will stay completely out of sight until the ceremony is over, and then you will leave quietly. We simply cannot risk you saying something stupid and embarrassing us in front of the brass." I looked at the cheap plastic ticket in my hand. I looked at my father, who was nodding in agreement with a smug, satisfied grin on his face. They truly believed they held all the power. They believed I was still the quiet, defenseless girl they had bullied and belittled a decade ago. They saw my plain suit and assumed I was a nobody. I did not argue. I did not throw the ticket back in her face. I simply offered a polite, icy smile. I will sit exactly where I belong, I told them. My father scoffed, turning his back on me. Just stay out of the way, dropout. As they marched off toward the VIP tent, secure in their delusion of superiority, the low rumble of a heavy engine vibrated through the parking lot. A sleek, armored black SUV pulled up to the curb just 50 yards away. Heavily armed military police officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the perimeter with trained precision. I reached up and discreetly touched the small, nearly invisible earpiece hidden beneath my hair. A crisp, professional voice crackled in my ear. "Target is on site, ma'am. General Mitchell is preparing to take the stage. We are holding your position." Copy that, I whispered into my lapel microphone. "Let the show begin." I adjusted my jacket, clutching the cheap blue ticket in my hand, and began my long walk to the back row. The asphalt radiated heat through the thin soles of my flats as I navigated away from the VIP tent. I had made it exactly 20 paces before a heavy hand clapped down on my shoulder, spinning me around. There stood my younger brother, Bradley. He was a vision in pristine dress whites, the newly pinned gold seal trident gleaming on his chest like a beacon of absolute arrogance. His jaw was set in that familiar, self-satisfied smirk he had perfected since high school. He looked exactly like the apex predator my father constantly claimed he was, and Bradley knew it. "Look who finally crawled out of her cubicle," Bradley sneered, looking me up and down with exaggerated pity. "I honestly did not think you would show. I figured being surrounded by actual winners would be too triggering for your fragile ego." I kept my hands at my sides. "Congratulations on the trident, Bradley. It is a significant achievement." He puffed out his chest, completely missing the neutral, unbothered tone of my voice. "Significant is an understatement, Paige. I am the top 1% of the top 1%. I am a lethal weapon. Meanwhile, what do you do again? Right, you type emails and fetch coffee in some boring corporate office." He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You must look at me and feel absolutely sick with jealousy." I let him have his moment. In my line of work, letting the enemy underestimate you was the first rule of engagement. "You look very sharp," I said simply. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Tonight is my night, dropout. I am king of this family now." Dad booked the private dining room at the Hotel del Coronado to celebrate my victory. "You are going to pick up the check. It is the least you can do to make yourself useful, since you bring absolutely zero pride to the family name. Consider it a tax for letting you breathe the same air as a hero." Before I could formulate a polite refusal, a commanding presence stepped up behind him. It was Imani, Bradley's wife. Imani was a brilliant corporate attorney, a striking African-American woman whose sharp intellect and quiet grace had always been a stark contrast to my brother's loud, abrasive energy. She wore a tailored emerald green dress that made her look like royalty, holding herself with a quiet dignity that demanded immediate respect. Over Bradley's broad shoulder, Imani locked eyes with me. She did not say a word, but she delivered a subtle, exhausted eye roll that spoke volumes. It was a silent message of solidarity, a shared understanding between the only two women in this family who actually worked for a living. She knew exactly how insufferable her husband could be, and I had always suspected she was counting down the days until she broke free from his shadow. Bradley unslung the massive, heavy canvas duffel bag from his shoulder. Without warning, he shoved it hard into my chest. "Take this to the car," he ordered, treating me like a hired servant. "My uniform needs to stay flawless for the general's inspection, and I am not sweating before the ceremony. Go fetch Paige." I braced myself to catch the heavy canvas, but Imani stepped forward with lightning speed. She intercepted the thick strap, her manicured hand gripping the canvas with surprising strength. She did not let the bag touch me. "She is a guest," Imani said, her voice smooth but laced with absolute authority. "Carry your own gear. You are supposed to be a hardened Navy SEAL, right? A 50-pound bag should be nothing for the apex predator of the family." Bradley whipped his head around to glare at his wife. The muscle in his jaw twitched furiously. "Do not undermine me in front of her, Imani. This is my day. Imani did not flinch. She held his furious gaze with the calm certainty of a woman who destroyed hostile witnesses in courtrooms for a living. Then act like it is your day, she replied smoothly, dropping the heavy bag directly onto his perfectly polished black shoes. Act like a professional instead of a schoolyard bully. Bradley gritted his teeth, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He snatched the bag off his shoes, his knuckles turning white around the strap. He knew better than to argue with Imani in public. She had a way of cutting him down to size without ever raising her voice, and he despised her for it. He turned his venom back to me, needing a target he thought he could actually break. "Listen to me, drop out!" Bradley snarled, pointing a thick finger in my face. "You are going to sit in the very back row. You are going to keep your mouth shut. General Mitchell, the commander of all special operations, is speaking today. I do not want your pathetic loser energy anywhere near the VIP section when I shake his hand. You are a stain on my perfect record. Do not make me regret letting you onto this base." With a final disgusted scoff, he turned on his heel and stormed off toward the reviewing stand, barking orders at a passing junior sailor as he went. Imani lingered for a fraction of a second. She gave me a tight, sympathetic smile, a silent apology for his behavior before turning to follow her infuriated husband. I stood alone on the hot asphalt, watching them walk away. The sun beat down on my shoulders, but my blood was running ice cold with anticipation. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel like a failure. I felt the profound electric thrill of a predator watching her prey walk willingly into a trap. Bradley wanted me in the back row. My parents wanted me hidden. They wanted General Mitchell to focus entirely on the golden child. I smiled faintly. It was a cold, calculated smile. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a sleek, heavily encrypted burner phone. I typed a rapid sequence of numbers to bypass the firewall, accessing a direct secure line to the Pentagon. The screen glowed green, confirming my authorization level. I sent a single encrypted text message to the security detail waiting in the black SUV near the staging area. "I am in position. Let the general know he has a green light to proceed." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, smoothed the lapels of my gray suit, and began my leisurely walk toward the cheap plastic chairs at the very back of the stadium. The stage was set. The players were in position. The family that had spent 14 years calling me a failure was about to learn exactly who ran the board. The general admission bleachers were a stark contrast to the shaded velvet-roped VIP pavilion where my family was currently settling in. Up here, the California sun beat down relentlessly on rows of flimsy, sun-bleached plastic chairs. My seat was in the very last row, pressed against a chain-link fence that separated the ceremony from the overflow parking lot. I sat down, the cheap plastic bending precariously under my weight. Around me were bored teenagers glued to their phones, distant relatives complaining about the heat, and a few solemn-faced young men who had clearly washed out of the program early on. It was the designated corner for the irrelevant and the forgotten. Exactly where my parents wanted me. From my vantage point at the top of the bleachers, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the front row. My father, Edward, was already holding court. He had cornered a distinguished-looking Navy captain and was gesturing wildly toward the parade deck where the graduating class was staging. Even from 100 yards away, over the murmur of the gathering crowd, Edward's booming theatrical voice carried through the sea air. "High is an absolute machine," Edward bragged to the captive captain, pointing proudly at Bradley. "Top of his class in marksmanship. I always knew he had the warrior gene. It skips a generation sometimes, but not with my boy." The captain offered a polite, strained smile, attempting to inch away, but Edward clamped a heavy hand on the man's shoulder. "Thank God my son isn't like my failure of a daughter." My father continued, his voice projecting loud enough for several surrounding families to turn their heads. "Washing out of Annapolis because she could not handle a few morning runs. Can you imagine the embarrassment? She actually showed up today in a cheap office suit. I barely let her show her face. I sent her to the back so she would not ruin the aesthetic of the day." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I watched my mother nod vigorously in agreement, whispering something to the captain's wife that made the poor woman look deeply uncomfortable. I watched Bradley puff out his chest from the staging area, soaking in our father's toxic adoration. I simply breathed in the salty ocean air and waited. The countdown clock in my head was ticking down to 0. A sudden sharp blast from a brass bugle sliced through the chatter. The crowd instantly hushed. The naval band struck up a crisp, synchronized march, and the ceremony officially began. The graduating class of Navy SEALs marched onto the parade deck in perfect, terrifying unison. They were a wall of pristine white uniforms and rigid discipline. Bradley was in the front rank, his chin jutting out, his eyes locked forward. He looked every bit the elite soldier he claimed to be. After the opening remarks and the presentation of the colors, the base commander stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the commander announced, his voice echoing across the massive stadium speakers. "Today we have the distinct honor of welcoming a man who needs no introduction. He is the commander of United States Special Operations Command. Please stand for General Thomas Mitchell." The entire base erupted. 300 newly minted SEALs snapped to attention with a sound like a thunderclap. The families leaped to their feet. Even the bored teenagers in the back row with me stood up, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. General Mitchell was a living legend. A 4-star commander who oversaw every elite strike force, every covert operation, and every Tier 1 asset in the United States military. He walked onto the stage with a slow, measured stride. He did not look at his notes. He did not offer a warm, grandfatherly smile. He projected absolute, unyielding authority. He stepped up to the podium, gripped the edges of the wood, and looked out over the sea of white uniforms. "You men are the tip of the spear." "General." Mitchell began, his deep, gravelly voice washing over the silent crowd. "You have endured the most brutal physical and mental conditioning on the planet. You have proven that you possess the muscle, the grit, and the sheer violence of action required to defend this nation." Down in the front row, I saw Edward practically vibrating with pride, elbowing the captain next to him as if he had personally trained the entire class. But the general continued, his tone suddenly shifting, dropping an octave lower. "Do not mistake your physical prowess for invincibility." The crowd stirred slightly. This was not the standard congratulatory speech. "Muscle and bullets are nothing without the invisible shield protecting them." General Mitchell said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "The next world war will not be fought on beaches like this one. It will not start with a gunshot or a missile strike. It will start with a keystroke. The enemies of freedom are not just training in the mud. They are hacking our grids, infiltrating our intelligence networks, and threatening the very infrastructure that allows you to operate." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The men and women defending that invisible front line, the ones operating in the absolute shadows of cyber warfare, they are the ones keeping your helicopters in the sky. They are the ones keeping your coordinates secure. They are the true apex predators of the modern era. And without them, every weapon you carry is completely useless. I smiled. The phrase apex predator was not a coincidence. I had briefed the general's staff on my brother's colorful vocabulary just an hour ago. General Mitchell stopped speaking mid-sentence. He let go of the podium. He narrowed his eyes, squinting against the bright California sun. He looked past the rigid rows of graduating SEALs. He looked past the velvet ropes of the VIP pavilion. He looked straight over my father's head, his gaze traveling up the metal bleachers. His eyes locked directly onto mine in the very last row. The silence in the stadium became deafening. 3,000 people held their breath, wondering why the 4-star general had suddenly stopped talking. The tension was thick enough to snap. General Mitchell stepped out from behind the podium. He ignored the small set of wooden stairs leading down from the stage and simply vaulted off the front edge, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He began walking straight down the center aisle. His pace was urgent, focused, and entirely unexpected. A wave of confusion rippled through the VIP section. People began leaning out of their chairs to see what was happening. My father, Edward, watched the 4-star general marching directly toward his row. Edward's chest swelled to twice its normal size. He looked frantically at Patricia, his face practically glowing with arrogant validation. He truly believed General Mitchell had stopped his keynote speech to come down and personally shake the hand of the man who had raised Bradley the star graduate. As General Mitchell closed the distance, Edward hastily buttoned his expensive suit jacket. He stepped out of his designated seat, planting himself right in the middle of the center aisle, completely blocking the path. Edward flashed a wide, self-important grin and extended his right hand, preparing to accept the ultimate validation he had sought his entire life. Edward stood there, his chest puffed out and his hand extended, expecting the ultimate validation. General Mitchell did not even break his stride. He blew right past my father as if Edward were nothing more than a misplaced piece of folding furniture. The physical brush of the general's shoulder sent my father stumbling back a half step. Edward's arrogant grin vanished instantly, his hand left hanging awkwardly in the empty air. The Navy captain he had been bragging to just moments before visibly recoiled, embarrassed for him. General Mitchell kept walking. The heavy thud of his combat boots echoed on the aluminum steps of the bleachers. He climbed past the confused relatives, past the whispering teenagers, straight up to the very last row. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of my flimsy, sun-bleached plastic chair. The legendary 4-star commander snapped to rigid attention. His hand sliced through the air in a perfect razor-sharp salute. "Vice Admiral," he boomed, his deep voice carrying effortlessly over the silent crowd. "We were not informed you were on base." The reaction was instantaneous. Down on the parade deck, 300 newly minted SEALs trained to react to their commander's cues with lethal speed pivoted on their heels. They spotted the general saluting the woman in the gray suit in the back row. As one single unified entity, 300 men snapped to attention. 300 hands rose in a synchronized salute. The sheer force of their boots hitting the asphalt sounded like a shockwave. The entire stadium froze in absolute, stunned silence. Down in the VIP section, all the color drained from Edward's face. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire reality fracture into pieces. Unable to comprehend what he was seeing, he scrambled up the first few steps of the bleachers, his voice trembling as he broke the sacred military silence. "General," my father stammered, his hands shaking wildly. "General, there must be some mistake. That is my daughter. She is a college dropout." General Mitchell slowly lowered his hand. He turned his head to look down at the man trembling on the steps below. The general's eyes were cold, calculating and utterly devoid of amusement. He stared at Edward with the kind of disdain usually reserved for traitors. "Dropout," he repeated, the word hanging in the heavy ocean air like a death sentence. "Your daughter did not drop out of Annapolis, sir. She was pulled from the academy by the National Security Agency. She is the commander of United States Fleet Cyber Command. 2 weeks ago, the President of the United States personally pinned her 3rd star for neutralizing a highly classified hack on the Pacific power grid." The general took a deliberate step toward my paralyzed father, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl. "Vice Admiral Page outranks every single man on this beach, including your son." The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood up slowly from my plastic chair. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, feeling the eyes of 3,000 people burning into me. I raised my right hand and returned the general's salute with crisp, practiced precision. "Thank you, General Mitchell," I said, my voice steady, calm, and projecting easily in the quiet stadium. "I appreciate the welcome. I am simply here to observe today." I lowered my hand and began my descent down the bleacher steps. As I approached my father, he physically shrank back against the railing. His mouth was opening and closing, but no sound came out. My mother, Patricia, stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, clutching her designer handbag like a shield, her face a mask of absolute terror. Down on the parade deck, Bradley was staring up at me, his jaw practically resting on the asphalt. The golden child had just realized he was not the highest-ranking person in his own family. He was a newly minted enlisted man. I was a 3-star admiral. The power dynamic of our entire existence had just been violently reversed in front of the entire United States Navy. I did not stop to gloat. I did not hurl insults. I simply glided past my paralyzed family without making eye contact, radiating the kind of absolute authority they could never buy. I walked straight past them and took my rightful place at the VIP podium, standing shoulder to shoulder with the base commanders. From the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Imani standing in the front row. The brilliant corporate attorney was the only person not looking at me with shock. Instead, she offered a slow, deeply satisfied smile. As the ceremony resumed, a frantic, buzzing vibration echoed against my ribs. I discreetly pulled my encrypted burner phone from my pocket, shielding the screen from the officers beside me. It was a secure text message from Imani. She must have typed it the second the general revealed my rank. I knew you were hiding something, the message read. We need to talk tonight. Your dad is completely bankrupt. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The humiliation of my family was complete, but the real war had just begun. The ceremony concluded with the traditional roar of the graduating class, but the atmosphere around my family remained suffocated by the sudden shift in power. I did not linger on the reviewing stand to soak in the applause. I exchanged professional pleasantries with General Mitchell, shook hands with the base commander, and made a quiet, dignified exit toward the VIP parking lot. I needed a moment away from the crowd to process the text message Imani had sent me. My father was completely bankrupt. That single piece of information reframed everything about his arrogant behavior on the bleachers. It was not just blind pride fueling his cruelty. It was a desperate theatrical performance designed to cover up a massive impending failure. I had almost reached my rental car when I heard the heavy, frantic slapping of leather shoes against the pavement behind me. I turned to see Edward practically sprinting across the asphalt. He was completely abandoning Bradley on the parade deck. Bradley had just achieved his lifelong dream of becoming a Navy SEAL, yet our father left his golden child standing there in his dress whites, just to chase after the daughter he had spent the last 14 years pretending did not exist. Edward caught up to me, his chest heaving, his face split into a wide, painfully artificial grin that did not reach his eyes. "Paige, wait up," he called out, projecting his voice so a passing group of senior naval officers would hear him. He threw a heavy arm around my shoulders, attempting to pull me into a tight paternal embrace. I remained perfectly stiff, my posture locked in rigid military bearing. "Look at you, my brilliant girl," he announced loudly to absolutely no one in particular. "3 stars on your collar. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I always told your mother you had the strategic mind of a true leader." The sheer whiplash of his behavior was nauseating. Less than 2 hours ago, I was a stain on the family record, a dropout who was not even allowed to sit in the shaded pavilion. Now I was his brilliant girl. He was trying to publicly claim ownership of my success, acting as if he had been my biggest supporter all along. I stepped smoothly out from under his heavy arm, keeping my expression politely blank. I insisted we go back to the family suite at the Hotel del Coronado to celebrate properly. I agreed, driven entirely by the need to understand exactly what he was plotting and to find an opportunity to speak with Imani away from Bradley. The hotel suite was a lavish display of wealth, featuring panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean and expensive champagne chilling in silver buckets. It was the kind of luxury I now knew he did not actually possess. Patricia and Bradley had not yet returned from the naval base. We were entirely alone in the massive living area. Edward did not offer me a glass of water. He did not offer an apology for the horrible things he had said to me that morning. He bypassed all normal human decency, walked straight over to his leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, meticulously bound folder. He slapped it down onto the glass coffee table with a heavy, commanding thud. He tapped the glossy cover with his index finger, looking at me with a predatory intensity. "We have a tremendous opportunity here, Paige," he said, his voice slick with salesman charm. "My logistics company is currently bidding on a $50 million defense contract. We supply the hardware and the specialized communication relays that the Navy relies on for overseas deployments. You are a vice admiral now. You sit at the very top of Fleet Cyber Command. You have the security clearance and the sheer influence to bypass the usual bureaucratic red tape. I need you to sign off on this bid and push it through procurement immediately." I stared at the folder, then back up at the man who had just demanded I commit federal corruption. "You want me to rig a $50 million military contract for you," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly flat. He smiled, spreading his hands open as if it were the most natural, reasonable request in the world. "Family helps family, Paige. We lift each other up when we have the power to do so. You have the authority to secure our family legacy for the next century. It is simply good business, and it is exactly what people in our position do for one another." I did not raise my voice. I did not show him an ounce of the disgust churning in my stomach. "You threw me out of this family 14 years ago, Edward. You told me I was a failure. You handed me a back row ticket this morning and told me to hide so I would not ruin your aesthetic. And now, because I wear stars on my collar, you think you can use my rank to fix your bankrupt company. Edward froze. The mention of his bankruptcy caused the artificial warmth to instantly evaporate from his face. The proud fawning father act vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by the vicious cornered man I recognized from my darkest childhood memories. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He took a slow, menacing step toward me, invading my personal space, just as he had done in the parking lot at Coronado. His mask had completely slipped. He leaned in close, his voice dropping into a venomous, quiet hiss that made the hairs on my arms stand up. You listen to me very carefully, he said, pointing a rigid finger just inches from my face. You are going to sign that contract page. You are going to push it through procurement by the end of the week, or I will go to the press tomorrow morning. I will call every major news outlet in this country and tell them that the youngest vice admiral in American history is a cold, calculating sociopath who abandoned her loving family the second she got a taste of power. I will tell them you are mentally unstable. I will tell them you despise the traditional military values your heroic brother stands for. I will completely destroy your public relations image and trigger a congressional inquiry before you even settle into your new command. You sign it or I ruin you. The echo of my father's threat hung in the sterile air of the hotel suite. You sign it or I ruin you. Edward stood inches from my face, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a manic desperation he was trying to pass off as authority. I looked at the vein pulsing in his neck. I did not feel fear. I felt the clinical detachment of a commander assessing a highly compromised target. Before I could even open my mouth to dismantle his pathetic extortion attempt, the heavy oak door of the suite flew open with a violent crash. The brass door handle slammed into the drywall, leaving a deep, jagged dent. Bradley stormed into the room. He was still wearing his pristine dress whites, but the sharp military bearing from the parade deck had completely evaporated. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his face was twisted into an ugly, petulant snarl. He marched past the marble entryway, completely ignoring our father standing over the $50 million contract. Bradley only had eyes for me. His heavy boots stomped across the plush carpet, closing the distance between us in seconds. You ruined everything, Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with unchecked rage. I spent years preparing for this day. I survived the most brutal training on the planet. This was supposed to be my coronation. I walk into the reception hall and what happens? Nobody wants to talk to me. Nobody cares about my trident. Every single flag officer, every instructor, every family member was just whispering about the phantom 3-star general who crashed the bleachers. He stepped dangerously close to me, his physical presence dominating the space. Edward actually took a step back, startled by his golden child's explosive entrance. You stole my spotlight, Paige, Bradley snarled, his breath washing over my face. The stench hit me instantly. Beneath the expensive cologne, he reeked of cheap bourbon. It was barely 2 in the afternoon, and the newly minted elite warrior had already been drinking heavily to soothe his bruised ego. You are going to fix this, Bradley demanded, jabbing a thick, calloused finger hard against my collarbone. You have the ultimate clearance. You outrank the base commanders. I earned this trident today, which means I am officially in the system. Now you owe me. You are going to make a phone call and fast-track my transfer directly into Naval Special Warfare Development Group. You are going to put me on SEAL Team 6 to make up for completely ruining my graduation. I stared at the finger pressing into my suit jacket. You want me to bypass the most rigorous selection process in the armed forces because your feelings got hurt at a party, I stated, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Bradley did not like that tone. His face flushed a dark, angry purple. He lunged forward, throwing both of his heavy hands onto my shoulders. He shoved me hard backward. My shoulder blades hit the textured wallpaper of the hotel wall with a solid thud. He pinned me there, using his significant weight advantage to trap me. You do not talk down to me, he spat, leaning his full body weight against my chest. You are going to make that call right now, dropout. I am the apex predator here. He expected me to cower. He expected me to panic just like the scrawny, terrified teenager he used to bully in the hallways of our childhood home. He had no idea what the military had actually done to me over the last 14 years. My rank was earned behind a desk, and in secure server rooms, yes. But reaching the top tier of the intelligence community required surviving classified black operations survival training. I had been taught how to neutralize physical threats by instructors who made the Coronado drill sergeants look like substitute teachers. I did not panic, I reacted. In one fluid, explosive motion, I dropped my center of gravity. I brought my left arm up hard, breaking the interior of his grip, while my right hand snapped forward like a coiled spring. I grabbed the wrist of his dominant arm, twisting it sharply outward while driving the heel of my palm directly into his elbow joint. Bradley let out a sharp, breathless yelp of pain as the joint locked out. Before he could process the counterattack, I pivoted my hips, using his own forward momentum against him. I drove him face first into the wall I had just been pinned against. I pinned his twisted arm high up between his shoulder blades, applying just enough precise, agonizing pressure to paralyze him completely. He grunted, his cheek smashed against the expensive wallpaper, his legs kicking uselessly as he tried to free himself. Edward shouted something in the background, but he did not dare step forward to intervene. "You are a tactical liability, Brad," I said, leaning in, so my voice was right next to his ear. "You are undisciplined, you are emotionally fragile, and right now you reek of alcohol in your dress uniform on an active duty installation. If I put you on a Tier 1 team, you would get your entire squad killed on your first deployment just to prove a point. You belong exactly where you are, at the very bottom of the food chain." I released his arm and shoved him away. Bradley stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, panting heavily. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and humiliated fury. He opened his mouth to scream another insult, ready to charge at me again. The heavy oak door to the suite clicked shut. We all froze. Imani was standing just inside the entryway. She had quietly followed her husband up from the reception. She stood there in her striking emerald green dress, her posture perfectly straight, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene. She looked at the dented wall. She looked at Edward cowering near the coffee table. She looked at Bradley rubbing his arm like a beaten child. Imani looked at her husband with an expression of absolute freezing disgust. "Leave her alone!" Brad, Imani said, her voice echoing in the quiet hotel suite with the force of a gavel striking wood. "Or I will tell the Vice Admiral exactly how you paid for your shiny new Porsche." Bradley froze. The alcohol and adrenaline instantly drained from his face, replaced by raw, naked panic. The threat of his pristine public image being shattered was the only thing capable of piercing his drunken rage. He slowly lowered his hands and stepped back from me, his chest heaving. He looked at Imani, his jaw working furiously as he tried to formulate a comeback, but he knew she held all the cards. With a final venomous glare in my direction, he turned on his heel and bolted from the hotel suite, slamming the heavy door behind him. Edward was still cowering near the coffee table, clutching his $50 million contract. He looked absolutely pathetic. I adjusted my jacket and turned my attention to Imani. She did not look at my father. She simply walked over to the entryway table, picked up her designer clutch, and looked me dead in the eye. "Midnight, Imani," said her voice, dropping to a volume Edward could not overhear. "The offshore coffee roaster on Highway 1. Come alone." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the suite, leaving me alone with the man who had just tried to extort a vice admiral. I did not say a single word to Edward. I picked up my bag and left him standing there in his own manufactured ruin. At midnight, a heavy fog had rolled in off the Pacific Ocean, blanketing the quiet streets of San Diego. I sat in a secluded corner booth at the back of the dimly lit coffee shop, my back against the wall so I could monitor the entrance. It was a basic security habit I had developed over a decade in intelligence. The bell above the door chimed and Imani walked in. Even in the middle of the night, she looked impeccably sharp in a tailored camel trench coat. She purchased 2 black coffees at the counter and glided over to my booth, sliding into the vinyl seat across from me. Up close, away from the toxic gravity of my family, I could truly appreciate the sharp analytical intelligence radiating from her. We did not exchange pleasantries. We did not pretend to be 2 long-lost sisters catching up. We were 2 professional women preparing to dismantle a mutual enemy. Imani reached into her coat pocket and placed a small silver USB drive onto the table. She kept her hand resting on top of it. "When I married Bradley, I thought I was marrying a dedicated public servant. Imani began, her dark eyes entirely devoid of emotion. But it took less than 6 months for the cracks to show. The math never made sense. He is a junior enlisted sailor, yet he drives a $100,000 sports car. He gambles heavily. He takes weekend trips to Las Vegas. I am a corporate attorney page. I specialize in forensic financial auditing. When the numbers do not add up, I start digging. I took a sip of my coffee, keeping my gaze locked on hers. And what did you find when you dug into my brother? I found out that your father is a thief, Imani stated bluntly. Edward did not just go bankrupt recently. His company has been insolvent for a decade. 10 years ago, right around the time you were recruited out of the academy, Edward was drowning in massive corporate debt. I was going to lose the house, the cars, and the business. But suddenly his company received a massive, untraceable influx of cash. Imani slid the silver drive across the table until it rested right in front of me. Your grandfather left a $5 million trust fund. Imani revealed, her voice steady and precise. He knew exactly what kind of man your father was, so he locked the trust up tight. The stipulations were incredibly clear. The money belonged solely to you, to be accessed only on your 25th birthday. Edward never told you about it. Instead, he forged your signature, bypassed the security protocols using a corrupt banking contact, and liquidated the entire $5 million. He washed the money through a series of offshore shell accounts to hide the trail. I stared at the small silver drive. $5 million. The money meant to secure my future had been stolen by the very man who threw me out of his house for being a failure. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I felt a cold, hyper-focused clarity taking over my brain. How much did he spend on the company, I asked. About half, Imani replied. The rest went to keeping Bradley out of federal prison. I looked up sharply. Excuse me. Imani leaned forward, lowering her voice. 7 years ago, Bradley was driving drunk. He blew through a red light and T-boned a minivan. It was a severe hit and run. He left a mother and her teenage son trapped in a crushed vehicle and fled the scene to protect his military application. Edward used your stolen inheritance to fix it. He paid an exorbitant cash settlement to the victims to ensure they dropped the charges. He paid off the local police to lose the physical evidence. And then, as a reward for avoiding prison, Edward bought Bradley that shiny new Porsche to replace his wrecked truck. The silence in the coffee shop felt suffocating. My brother wore the seal trident. He called himself a hero. He walked around demanding respect and demanding I pay for his celebration dinner, all while his entire life was funded by the money they stole from me. They had built their entire empire of arrogance on a foundation of my stolen legacy. I reached into my bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted military tablet. I booted up the device, bypassed the biometric security lock, and plugged the silver USB drive into the side port. Look at the routing numbers on the spreadsheet titled Vanguard, Imani instructed, pointing at the screen. It tracks exactly how Edward funneled your money into his corporate accounts. I opened the main directory on the drive, but my eyes did not go to the financial spreadsheets. Years of analyzing high-threat cyber networks had trained my brain to recognize anomalies instantly. Nestled between the financial folders was a subdirectory labeled with strict Department of Defense procurement codes. It was heavily encrypted, but Imani had copied the raw, unencrypted backup files. I tapped the folder. Hundreds of high-resolution schematics and circuit diagrams flooded my screen. What is that? Imani asked, noticing the sudden shift in my posture. I zoomed in on the primary circuit board diagram. It was the blueprint for the encrypted communication relays Edwards Logistics Company was currently supplying to the United States Navy. It was the exact hardware that ships and special operations teams use to transmit secure coordinates in hostile territories. I analyzed the microscopic rendering of the microchips embedded in the motherboard. My blood ran absolutely cold. The breath caught in my throat. This is not just about stolen money anymore, I whispered, staring in horror at the schematics. I looked up at Imani, realizing the true magnitude of what we had just uncovered. My father was not just a thief. He was something much worse. I zoomed in on the motherboard schematic illuminating my tablet screen. My training at the National Security Agency had burned the architecture of military-grade hardware into my brain, and the components Edward was putting into these communication relays were entirely wrong. I pointed to a cluster of microscopic nodes on the digital blueprint. These are not authorized Department of Defense components. I told Imani, my voice tight with a sickening realization. These are cheap counterfeit microchips manufactured on the black market. They are highly susceptible to remote hacking, and worse, they are notorious for failing under extreme combat conditions. Imani leaned over the table, her dark eyes studying the screen. What exactly does this hardware do, Paige? It is the primary encrypted communication relay for forward deployed naval units, I explained, feeling a cold knot of dread twisting in my stomach. If a special operations team is pinned down in hostile territory, they rely on these specific relays to transmit secure coordinates for air support or medical evacuation. If the hardware fries because my father wanted to save 40 cents on a microchip, those men die in the dirt. Their radios will just transmit dead air. I looked up at Imani, the full gravity of the situation settling over us. He is supplying these compromised units to naval special warfare. The exact same teams his golden child was just assigned to. Edward is putting counterfeit chips into the hands of active duty personnel. He is risking the lives of American troops just to artificially inflate his profit margins and hide his bankruptcy. Imani covered her mouth with her hand. Her sharp legal mind instantly categorized the crime. As a corporate attorney, she had seen embezzlement and fraud, but this crossed a terrifying new threshold. That is not just corporate fraud. Fraud, she whispered, her voice laced with absolute horror. That is treason. He is selling out the United States military. The silence in the coffee shop felt thick and heavy. A few hours ago, I thought I was simply dealing with a toxic father who had stolen my inheritance to fund his own arrogance. Now I was looking at a man who was actively sabotaging national security. I had spent my entire adult life building invisible shields to protect this country, and my own father was drilling holes in the armor for a paycheck. Before either of us could say another word, the silence was shattered by the sudden sharp ringing of my secure phone. The caller identification flashed brightly on the table. It was Edward. I looked at Imani. She gave me a firm, silent nod. I answered the call, keeping my breathing perfectly steady, locking away the fury burning in my chest. Paige, my brilliant girl, Edward's voice boomed through the speaker. He did not sound like the desperate cornered man who had just tried to extort me in a hotel suite. He sounded jovial, magnanimous, and sickeningly warm. I know things got a little heated earlier today, but passion runs high in our family. We are warriors. We clash and then we unite. I want to put that little misunderstanding behind us. The absolute audacity of the man was staggering. He genuinely believed that because I had not immediately ordered his arrest at the hotel, I was submitting to his authority. He mistook my tactical retreat for surrender. I am listening, Edward, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. I have been thinking about our future, he continued, his voice swelling with manufactured affection. Next week is Thanksgiving. I am hosting an enormous dinner at the mansion. I have invited the top defense contractors in California, a few state senators, and several retired generals. It is going to be the absolute social event of the season. I want you there, Paige, sitting right by my side at the head of the table. I stared at the schematics of the counterfeit microchips on my tablet while listening to him brag. He was inviting the very people he was actively defrauding into his home to eat his food and drink his wine. Come home, Paige, he urged, laying his salesman charm on thick. Let us announce our partnership to the world. Show everyone that the mighty Vice Admiral and her father are an unstoppable team. You sign off on my logistics contract and I will introduce you to the most powerful political donors in the state. We will be royalty. Family helps family, right? I looked across the small table at Imani, the brilliant attorney who had endured years of this family's toxic abuse, was staring back at me with eyes as cold and hard as steel. We had the forensic financial records proving he stole my $5 million trust fund. We had the raw data files proving he was committing treason by supplying compromised hardware to the Navy. We had everything we needed to burn his empire to the ground, and he was handing us the matches. I will be there, Edward, I said smoothly, injecting just enough warmth into my voice to feed his massive ego. I would not miss it for the world. Fantastic, he cheered, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him. See you on Thanksgiving, Admiral. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. I turned the tablet screen toward Imani, highlighting the undeniable proof of my father's treason alongside the records of his theft. He wants to make a public announcement. I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. He wants a grand spectacle in front of every major defense contractor, politician, and retired general in his social circle. He wants to use my stars to validate his corruption. Imani leaned back in the vinyl booth, crossing her arms over her trench coat. She matched my smile with a predatory grin of her own. And what are we going to do about that, Admiral? I tapped the screen, locking away the evidence that would soon destroy the man who had called me a failure. I want a spectacle, I replied softly. Let us give him one. The evening arrived with a chilling marine layer rolling over the upscale hills of La Jolla. Edward had pulled out all the stops for his grand spectacle. Valets rushed to park luxury sedans and armored government vehicles along the sprawling circular driveway of the mansion. Inside, the massive foyer echoed with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low, self-important murmur of California elite. He had invited over 100 guests. I recognized state senators, aggressive defense contractors, and a handful of retired generals who still wielded massive influence in Washington. It was a room packed with absolute power and predatory wealth. I stepped through the double oak doors wearing my formal dress blue uniform. The 3 silver stars on my collar caught the light from the massive crystal chandelier overhead. The moment I crossed the threshold, the conversations nearest to me died down into awed whispers. Edward materialized instantly. He was sweating slightly inside his custom tuxedo, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. He bypassed a polite greeting and immediately clamped his heavy hand around my upper arm. His grip was entirely too tight, a physical manifestation of his desperate need to control me. He dragged me into the center of the grand dining room, practically parading me around like a prized hunting trophy. Look who finally made it! Edward boomed, his voice cutting through the elegant jazz music playing from the hidden speakers. My brilliant girl is home. He steered me toward a group of wealthy logistics executives, keeping his hand firmly clamped on my bicep. He wanted everyone in the room to see that he owned the Vice Admiral of United States Fleet Cyber Command. He loudly introduced me to the CEO of a major shipbuilding firm, boasting about my clearance levels and my strategic brilliance. He explicitly told them that our family was entering a historic defense partnership. He promised them that my command and his company were about to merge their interests to secure the future of the Pacific Fleet. I did not pull my arm away. I did not correct his outrageous lies. I simply offered a cold, practiced smile to every politician and contractor he shoved in front of me. I let him weave his massive web of deceit, knowing that every single lie he told to these influential guests would only make his impending destruction that much more spectacular. After an hour of playing the compliant silent daughter, I finally managed to slip away from Edward's suffocating grip. I stepped into the massive industrial-grade kitchen to get a glass of sparkling water. The catering staff was busy plating the roasted turkey and autumn vegetables, moving with frantic precision. I barely had a moment of quiet before the heavy swinging door pushed open. Patricia marched into the kitchen, her expensive silk gown rustling aggressively. She quickly dismissed a passing waiter with a sharp wave of her hand, ensuring we were completely alone near the marble island. Her face, usually injected with Botox and perfectly powdered, was twisted into a tight, frantic scowl. She marched right up to me, leaning in so close I could smell the gin on her breath. "Do not you dare embarrass your father tonight," Patricia whispered harshly, her voice vibrating with toxic anxiety. "He has put everything on the line for this dinner. You are going to go out there, you are going to smile, and you are going to publicly endorse his company." I took a slow sip of my water, looking down at the woman who had happily allowed my father to throw me onto the street 14 years ago. "You owe him this contract, Paige," she hissed, jabbing her manicured finger toward my decorated uniform. "You were such a difficult, ungrateful teenager. You caused us so much stress when you dropped out of the academy and ran away. Your father suffered because of your selfishness. He is giving you a chance to finally make things right and repay this family for everything we endured. Do not ruin this." I stared at her. She was fiercely defending a man who had forged my signature, stolen $5 million from my grandfather, and was actively committing treason by selling counterfeit microchips to the military. She was so deeply embedded in his delusions of grandeur that she actually believed I owed them a $50 million favor for the privilege of being abused. I am going to give Edward exactly what he deserves tonight, I told her, my voice eerily calm. You should go take your seat, Patricia. You will not want to miss the announcements. I walked past her, leaving her standing in the kitchen, and re-entered the grand dining room. The catering staff was directing the high society guests to take their seats at the massive, elongated banquet tables. The room smelled of roasted herbs, expensive wine, and burning wax from the dozens of candelabras lining the centerpieces. I found my assigned seat right at the head table, positioned directly between Edward and my brother. Across the table, Imani sat perfectly still. She wore a sharp, dark maroon dress, her posture radiating absolute readiness. She caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The forensic financial files and the black market schematics were locked and loaded on my secure device. The trap was primed. Before the first course could even be served, a loud, sharp ringing noise echoed through the cavernous room. Bradley was standing at the corner of the head table. He held a silver spoon, aggressively clinking it against his crystal champagne flute to command the attention of the room. He was wearing his navy dress uniform, the seal trident catching the candlelight. His face was flushed with alcohol and monumental arrogance. The low chatter of the politicians and generals faded into silence. 100 influential guests turned their attention to the golden child. Bradley lowered the spoon and raised his glass. He smirked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with a toxic, predatory entitlement. He was preparing to take credit for my entire existence in front of a room full of absolute power. The sharp ringing of the silver spoon against the crystal champagne flute sliced through the low ambient noise of the grand dining room. One by one, the state senators, aggressive defense contractors, and retired generals fell silent. They turned their attention to the head table where my brother stood. Bradley adjusted his pristine white dress uniform, making sure the flickering candlelight caught the heavy gold of his newly pinned seal trident. He flashed a brilliant, entirely artificial smile at the sea of influential faces. "We are gathered here today to give thanks," Bradley began, his voice projecting with the practiced ease of a man used to getting whatever he wanted. "Thanks for family, for security, and for the strength that keeps this great nation safe from those who wish to do us harm." He gestured expansively around the opulent room before turning his gaze down to me. The smugness radiating from him was a physical force. "But tonight I want to give a special thanks to my sister Paige." I kept my face perfectly neutral, resting my hands loosely in my lap. Across the wide banquet table, Imani took a slow, deliberate sip of her sparkling water. Her dark eyes were fixed on her husband like a hawk watching a rat step into an open field. "A lot of you look at Paige today and see a 3-star Admiral." Bradley continued, pacing slightly behind the head table to ensure every eye in the room followed him. "But I remember the girl who could not handle the pressure at the Naval Academy. I remember the girl who was too soft, the girl who needed to be pushed to her absolute limits. And let me tell you, I pushed her. I showed her what real grit looked like." He let out a low, self-deprecating chuckle that was anything but humble. Honestly, if I had not been so hard on Paige, if I had not shown her the brutal standard of excellence required to wear a uniform, in this family, she never would have developed the thick skin needed to be an admiral. Bradley leaned over the table and raised his crystal flute directly toward me. "You are welcome, sis." A warm, appreciative murmur rippled through the dining room. The wealthy guests chuckled, completely buying into the narrative of the tough, loving military brother who had aggressively mentored his struggling sister to greatness. They saw a beautiful, unified family, forged in the fires of discipline. They had no idea they were applauding a man who had funded his entire elite existence, his legal defenses, and his luxury sports car with my stolen inheritance. I nodded gracefully, offering a tight, closed-lip smile. I let him bask in the applause. I let him feel the absolute peak of his unearned glory, knowing that the higher he climbed the ladder of his own delusion, the more devastating his impact with the concrete was going to be. As the polite laughter died down, Edward pushed his heavy mahogany chair back and stood up. He clapped Bradley firmly on the shoulder, playing the role of the proud patriotic patriarch to absolute perfection. He smoothly took the microphone from his golden child and turned to face his wealthy guests. "Thank you, Bradley," Edward boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted painted ceilings. "That bond, that relentless push for excellence, is exactly what this family is built upon. And it is exactly what my company brings to the table every single day." Edward began pacing the floor, treating the Thanksgiving dinner like a high-stakes boardroom pitch. I watched as he made deliberate eye contact with the retired generals and the powerful acquisition officials seated at the prime tables. For years, my logistics firm has proudly supplied the hardware that keeps our warfighters connected in the most hostile environments on Earth. Edward declared, his chest puffing out inside his custom tuxedo. But the battlefield is changing. The global threats are evolving faster than ever before. And to meet those threats, we need absolute synergy between our physical hardware and our advanced cyber defenses. He turned and extended his arm toward me, an open, inviting gesture that masked a steel trap. That is why tonight is not just a holiday dinner. It is a massive milestone in national security. I am incredibly proud to announce that my company will be entering into a historic exclusive partnership with United States Fleet Cyber Command. A wave of genuine excitement swept through the crowd of contractors and politicians. A partnership like that was worth its weight in gold. It meant guaranteed government money for decades. They looked at me with newfound greedy respect. My brilliant daughter, Vice Admiral Page, understands that protecting this nation means keeping our supply chains within trusted networks, Edward proclaimed, locking eyes with me. His gaze was hard, commanding, and heavily loaded with his earlier threat. He was silently daring me to contradict him in front of the most powerful people in the state. "Page, come up here. Come stand by your father. Let us seal this deal and show everyone what the future of defense looks like." The room erupted into applause. The trap was perfectly laid. In Edward's mind, I was completely cornered. If I refused, I would cause a massive, embarrassing public scene, ruining my own professional image and triggering the smear campaign he had threatened. If I complied, I would be legally and socially binding myself to his corrupt $50 million contract. He thought he had maneuvered me into a checkmate. He had no idea I owned the board. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my dress blue uniform, ensuring every ribbon and medal was perfectly aligned. I did not rush. I walked around the massive banquet table with the measured, deliberate stride of an executioner. The applause continued as I approached the center of the room, stopping right next to the massive 80-inch smart television screen Edward had set up behind the podium to display his rotating corporate logo. Edward grinned, stepping toward me with the microphone extended, ready to wrap his arm around my shoulder for the press cameras flashing in the back of the room. I did not take the microphone. Instead, I reached into the interior pocket of my uniform jacket and pulled out my heavily encrypted military smartphone. I bypassed the biometric lock and accessed the secure files Imani and I had compiled in the coffee shop. Without looking at my father, I stepped past him and plugged my device directly into the master input cable connecting to the mansion's massive display system. The screen flickered. Edward's glossy corporate logo vanished, instantly replaced by the stark, intimidating black background of my secure military interface. The applause in the room faltered, transforming into a confused, heavy silence. Edward's hand dropped, his brow furrowed in sudden, sharp irritation. "Paige, what are you doing with the screen?" he hissed under his breath, leaning in close so the microphones would not pick up his voice. I ignored him. I turned to face the crowd of 100 influential guests, the glow of the massive screen illuminating the 3 silver stars on my collar. I looked at the retired generals who had trusted this man. I looked at Bradley, whose smug grin was slowly melting off his face as confusion set in. I looked at Imani, who sat perfectly poised, watching the fuse burn down to the powder keg. Finally, I turned my head and looked dead into my father's eyes. "Let's talk about our partnership, Edward." I tapped the screen on my encrypted smartphone. The high-resolution scan of the original trust fund document filled the massive 80-inch display. The bold, undeniable signature of my grandfather sat at the bottom right below the exact figure, $5 million. "For the past hour, my father has regaled you with stories of family loyalty. I projected my voice, ensuring it reached the furthest corners of the grand dining room. He told you that we lift each other up. He told you that he pushed me to greatness. What he conveniently left out of his heartwarming Thanksgiving speech was how he funded this lavish lifestyle and this very company. I tapped my screen again. A new document appeared alongside the trust fund. It was a forensic bank transfer record highlighted in bright yellow, showing the entire $5 million being liquidated and funneled into a series of offshore shell accounts before landing directly in the operating budget of his logistics firm. My father claims I owe him for the privilege of being raised in this house. I continued, my eyes scanning the shocked faces of the state senators and defense contractors. But according to these forensic financial records, he owes me $5 million. That money was left solely to me by my grandfather, intended to be accessed on my 25th birthday. Instead, it was stolen via forgery 10 years ago to save a failing company from total bankruptcy. A collective gasp rippled through the banquet hall. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the massive television screen. The powerful men and women in the room, people who dealt with billion-dollar budgets and stringent compliance laws, stared at the undeniable proof of federal fraud glaring down at them. Edward's carefully constructed facade shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He dropped the microphone. It hit the hardwood floor with a harsh, piercing screech of feedback that made several guests wince. "Turn that off!" Edward hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of panic and rage. He scrambled toward the massive television console, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking too tight, too restrictive for his frantic movements. He dropped to his knees, his hands blindly grasping behind the monitor, desperately trying to find the master power cable to yank it from the wall. I stood directly in front of the console, an immovable barrier of dark blue fabric and silver stars. I did not step aside. "This is a lie," Edward shouted, abandoning the cables and spinning around to face the horrified crowd. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead. "Listen to me, all of you. Do not look at that screen. My daughter is unwell. The pressure of her new command, it has broken her mind. She is having a severe mental breakdown. These documents are complete fabrications created by a sick, delusional woman." From the kitchen doorway, Patricia pushed her way into the dining room. She saw the bank statements glowing on the screen and let out a shrill, hysterical cry. "Paige, stop this right now. You are destroying your family. You are ruining your father." "I am not destroying anything, Patricia," I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room. "I am simply bringing the accounting up to date." Bradley, watching his lavish inheritance and his golden child status evaporate before his eyes, decided that intellectual combat was beyond him. Fueled by several glasses of premium champagne and a lifetime of unchecked aggression, he reverted to the only tool he possessed: brute force. "Shut up!" Bradley roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure drunken fury. He shoved his heavy mahogany chair backward so violently it crashed to the floor. He charged the stage, his heavy boots pounding against the hardwood. He intended to physically tackle me away from the podium and smash the encrypted device in my hand. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight into a clumsy, undisciplined tackle. I did not even blink. I simply pivoted on my heel, shifting my weight effortlessly to the side. Bradley's momentum carried him forward into empty air. He crashed hard into the wooden podium, sending it splintering to the ground, his uniform tangling in the microphone wires. He hit the floor with a pathetic, heavy thud, groaning as the wind was knocked completely out of his lungs. I looked down at my brother, then tapped my smartphone screen for a third time. The display shifted. Now, alongside the corporate transfers, appeared a series of personal wire transfers. "I did not just use the stolen money to save the company," I announced to the captivated room. "A significant portion of my grandfather's trust was used to pay off local law enforcement and quietly settle a catastrophic hit-and-run accident caused by my brother 7 years ago. The rest was used to purchase the luxury sports car sitting in the driveway right now." Edward was hyperventilating. He backed away from the screen, his eyes wide and wild as he looked at the retired generals who were now staring at him with undisguised revulsion. "It is fake," Edward screamed, his voice cracking with utter desperation. "She hacked the system. She is a cyber specialist. She fabricated every single number up there to frame me because she hates this family. You cannot believe a word she says. The room hung in a terrible suspended animation. Edward was desperately banking on the hope that these powerful men would choose to believe a fellow businessman over a woman they had only just met. He was praying that his long-standing social capital would shield him from the glaring digital evidence. Then a calm, authoritative voice sliced through the chaos. "It is not a breakdown, Edward." Imani stood up slowly from her seat at the center of the grand banquet table. The brilliant corporate attorney smoothed the front of her dark maroon dress, her posture radiating absolute unyielding power. She did not look at her husband groveling on the floor. She did not look at her mother-in-law weeping in the doorway. She kept her sharp, intelligent dark eyes locked entirely on my father. The crowd parted slightly as Imani took a measured step toward the front of the room. She stood tall, a striking, undeniable force of truth, cutting through the suffocating web of my father's lies. "These documents are not fabrications," Imani stated, her voice projecting clearly and confidently to every person in the room. "I know they are real because I am the one who audited your books." Edward staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His mouth dropped open, his eyes darting between me and his daughter-in-law, the absolute betrayal short-circuiting his brain. "Every single financial record on that screen is entirely authentic." Imani continued, delivering the final crushing blow with surgical precision. "I pulled them directly from your own secure corporate servers. I tracked every stolen dollar, every offshore shell account, and every forged signature. And the evidence was submitted to the Internal Revenue Service 3 days ago." The words hung in the air like a guillotine dropping. For a fraction of a second, absolute paralysis gripped the entire banquet hall. The state senators and defense contractors stared at Imani, the brilliant attorney standing tall in her dark maroon dress, holding her ground against a room full of power. Then the paralysis broke and Bradley snapped. The alcohol fueling his system ignited into pure, unadulterated panic. He scrambled up from the floor, stumbling over the splintered remains of the wooden podium he had just crashed into. His dress-white uniform was wrinkled and stained with spilled wine, but he did not care. He locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto his wife. "You traitor!" Bradley roared, his voice cracking with a hysterical edge. He shoved a heavy dining chair out of his way, marching toward Imani with his fists clenched. "You ungrateful backstabber. I brought you into this family. I gave you this lifestyle. You are my wife and you sold out my father to the federal government." Imani did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward. She looked at the man she had married with a level of cold disgust that could freeze boiling water. "I am a corporate attorney who refuses to go to federal prison for a family of delusional criminals," Imani replied, her voice cutting through his screaming like a scalpel. "You did not give me anything, Brad. I earned my career. You bought yours with stolen money." Bradley raised his hand, his face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. He took another step toward her, intending to physically intimidate the woman who had just dismantled his father's empire. I did not give him the chance. "Leave her alone, Brad!" I commanded, my voice projecting across the room with the sharp authority of a military commander. "Your fight is with me." I tapped the screen of my encrypted smartphone for the second time. The massive 80-inch display behind me shifted instantly. The offshore shell accounts and corporate fraud spreadsheets vanished. In their place, a heavily detailed timeline appeared, divided into 3 distinct columns. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the screen. Whatever drunken confidence he had left evaporated the moment he recognized the documents glaring down at him. "My father was not the only one who benefited from my stolen inheritance," I announced to the captivated audience. The defense contractors and retired generals leaned in, unable to look away from the digital execution happening right in front of them. "My brother loves to call himself the apex predator of this family. He loves to brag about his grit, his discipline, and his moral superiority. Let us look at what his so-called honor actually costs." I tapped my screen to highlight the first column. High-resolution scans of buried police reports and non-disclosure agreements filled the display. 7 years ago, I explained, keeping my gaze fixed on Bradley. My brother drove his truck through a red light while severely intoxicated. He crashed into a minivan, injuring a mother and her teenage son. Instead of facing the consequences like a real man, he fled the scene to protect his military application. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Several naval officers in the room exchanged disgusted looks. My father used my stolen trust fund to quietly settle the civil suits and bribe local officials to bury the physical evidence. I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He bought Bradley's freedom, and then as a reward for avoiding a federal prison sentence, he used more of my money to buy him a brand new luxury sports car. Bradley was shaking. His mouth opened, but he could not form a single coherent word. He looked at the retired generals who had been clapping for him just 20 minutes ago. Now they were staring at him with absolute contempt. But it does not stop there, I said. Tapping the screen again to highlight the second and third columns, I displayed a long, undeniable list of wire transfers and credit card receipts. Here are the records of his weekend trips to Las Vegas, featuring massive, catastrophic gambling debts entirely paid off by my grandfather's money, I stated, reading off the staggering numbers. And here are the receipts for diamond necklaces and expensive hotel suites. Gifts and rooms purchased for women who were decidedly not his wife. Imani stood perfectly still, her chin raised high, watching her husband's secret life broadcast to the most powerful people in the state. She had known all of it. She had tracked every single cent. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob from the kitchen doorway, covering her face with her hands. She could no longer defend her golden child. The evidence was too overwhelming, too meticulously documented. I stepped away from the console and walked slowly toward Bradley. He looked completely shattered. The arrogant seal who had shoved a heavy duffel bag into my chest that morning was gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified little boy whose entire existence had just been exposed as a fraud. I stopped right in front of him. I stared dead into his bloodshot eyes. "You wear the trident, Brad," I said softly, but with enough venom to make him physically recoil. "But you bought your honor with my money. You are not an apex predator. You are a parasite." He swallowed hard, trembling under the weight of his absolute destruction. "You cannot do this to me, Paige," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The Navy is all I have." I smiled. It was not a kind smile. I did not just send these financial records to the IRS. I told him, making sure every word landed like a physical blow. "I sent the entire dossier, the hit-and-run cover-up, the gambling debts, and the illicit affairs directly to your commanding officer at Coronado." Bradley stopped breathing. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. Right on cue, the sharp, persistent ringing of a cell phone pierced the silence of the dining room. The sound was coming from Bradley's jacket pocket. He slowly, mechanically reached inside his pristine white uniform. He pulled out his phone with a shaking hand. He looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a number he knew all too well. It was Naval Special Warfare Command. He stared at the screen in absolute paralyzing horror. The ringing of the phone echoed in the cavernous dining hall, sharp and relentless. Bradley stared at the glowing screen as if it were a live grenade. Naval Special Warfare Command. He did not answer it. His fingers went completely numb, and the device slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. He dropped to his knees right beside the splintered podium, his hands gripping his hair. His perfect dress uniform, the one he had proudly paraded around all day, was now a symbol of his absolute ruin. The golden child had been completely dismantled. Edward watched his son crumble to the floor. Instead of rushing forward to comfort him, Edward did exactly what a cornered animal does. He pivoted to save his own skin. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand and forced a rigid, ghastly smile toward the prime banquet tables. "Please excuse this unfortunate family drama," Edward announced, his voice shaking, but desperately trying to project authority. "My daughter is clearly harboring deep-seated resentments from her childhood. But let us separate personal grievances from professional reality. You all know me. You know my company. We are essential to the United States Navy. My logistics network is the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. We are talking about national security here, not petty family squabbles over money." I stepped away from Bradley's kneeling form and walked back to the console. "You want to talk about national security, Edward?" I tapped the screen of my smartphone for the final time. The damning financial records vanished. In their place, a highly complex, glowing blue schematic of a communications motherboard appeared on the 80-inch screen. It was a digital rendering of the exact hardware Edward's company was currently contracted to supply to the military. I magnified a specific cluster of microscopic nodes on the display. Edward frowned, squinting at the screen, not fully understanding what he was looking at. But the retired generals and defense contractors in the room understood immediately. They leaned forward in their mahogany chairs, their eyes narrowing at the digital blueprints. The casual atmosphere of a Thanksgiving dinner had instantly transformed into the tense environment of a war room. "You tell these people, you are the backbone of the fleet," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and projecting it to every corner of the room. "Let us look at what you are actually putting into the hands of active duty personnel." I pointed to the magnified nodes on the screen. "These are the encrypted communication relays used by forward-deployed naval units. When a special operations team is pinned down in hostile territory, they rely on this exact hardware to transmit secure coordinates for extraction, medical evacuation, and air support. If this equipment fails, those men die in the dirt. Their radios will transmit nothing but dead air." I turned to look directly at Edward, letting the full weight of my rank and authority press down on him. "But you decided that military-grade components were too expensive." I continued, my words striking him like physical blows. "You decided to artificially inflate your profit margins to cover up your massive bankruptcy. So you bypassed federal regulations. You swapped the authorized tested components for cheap counterfeit microchips manufactured on the black market." A collective gasp of sheer horror swept through the room. The defense contractors, people who understood the lethal, catastrophic consequences of a compromised supply chain, stared at Edward with open revulsion. "You did not just steal from me, Edward," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unyielding clarity. "You put counterfeit chips into Navy comms. You put American lives directly in the crosshairs because you wanted to save 40 cents on a microchip. You committed treason for a profit margin." The reaction from the military men in the room was immediate and visceral. The retired generals, men who had commanded troops under heavy fire, men who had written letters to grieving mothers, physically stood up from their banquet tables. They stepped away from Edward as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. One of the generals, a decorated veteran with a stern, weathered face, looked at my father with absolute freezing disgust. He shook his head slowly, a silent condemnation that spoke louder than any shout. Edward panicked. He realized he was losing the very people he had invited to validate his empire. He looked at the generals, holding his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Do not listen to her. She fabricated this. She hacked my servers and planted those files to frame me because she is a bitter, jealous girl. I am a patriot. I would never put our boys in danger. You have to believe me." He looked frantically toward Patricia for support, begging his wife to back up his lies. But my mother was backed against the kitchen doorway, her hands covering her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of their destruction finally set in. She had no defense left to offer him. She could only watch as the luxurious life she had prized above her own daughter went up in flames. Edward turned his manic, desperate gaze back to me. "You have no authority here," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my uniform. "You are a spiteful woman playing dress-up. I am going to call the police. I am going to have you arrested right now for corporate espionage and slander. You are going to prison, Paige." I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had tormented me for 14 years completely unravel. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue with his pathetic threats. A sudden piercing wail sliced through the heavy tension of the dining room. It was not a single siren. It was a chorus of them, loud, aggressive, and multiplying by the second. The sound tore through the quiet, affluent neighborhood, growing deafeningly loud as multiple vehicles converged on the mansion. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light suddenly illuminated the darkness outside. The intense strobing colors pierced through the massive floor-to-ceiling dining room windows, washing over the terrified, ashen face of my father. The deafening wail of sirens outside the mansion abruptly cut off, replaced by the aggressive screech of heavy tires skidding to a halt on the paved circular driveway. Red and blue emergency lights violently strobed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand dining room, casting wild, frantic shadows across the terrified faces of the wealthy elite. The polite, sophisticated atmosphere of the Thanksgiving banquet had instantly evaporated. In its place was the raw, paralyzing tension of a nightmare becoming reality. Before anyone could even rush to the windows to see what was happening, the heavy double oak doors of the mansion foyer were not just opened, they were forcefully breached. Heavy combat boots stomped violently onto the imported Italian marble. Federal agents poured into the house. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with bold, bright yellow letters stamped across their backs. FBI, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They did not pause to ask for permission to enter. They did not stop to admire the crystal chandeliers or the expensive floral centerpieces. They moved into the dining room with absolute terrifying precision, spreading out to secure the perimeter in a matter of seconds. The state senators, defense contractors, and retired generals immediately backed away from the tables, raising their hands slightly to show they were not a threat. They recognized a coordinated high-level federal raid when they saw one, and no one wanted to be caught in the crossfire. Edward stood completely frozen at the head of the banquet table. The color had entirely abandoned his face. His confident, booming salesman persona had vanished, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell of a man. As the lead federal agent marched directly toward him, Edward raised his trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Officers, please, there is a massive misunderstanding here." Edward stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to invoke his social status. "I am a prominent defense contractor. I am hosting a private holiday dinner for highly influential people. You have the wrong house." The lead agent did not care about Edward's wealth, his mansion, or his influential guests. He did not slow down to negotiate. He stepped right into Edward's personal space, grabbed him by the shoulder of his custom-tailored tuxedo, and spun him around with brutal, unyielding force. Edward let out a shocked gasp as the agent shoved him hard against the edge of the dining table. The physical impact was devastating to the meticulously arranged banquet. Edward slammed face first into the lavish Thanksgiving spread. Crystal champagne flutes shattered instantly, sending shards of glass and expensive wine flying across the hardwood floor. The massive golden brown roasted turkey was violently knocked off its silver platter, crashing to the ground. Porcelain bowls of rich brown gravy and cranberry sauce flipped over, splattering thick, sticky liquid all over the front of Edward's pristine suit jacket and designer shirt. His cheek was pressed hard into the spilled wine and mashed potatoes as the cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The sharp click of the locking mechanism echoed sharply in the silent room. "Edward, you are under arrest for defrauding the federal government, forgery, and treason," the lead agent announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy as he read the Miranda rights. From the kitchen doorway, Patricia watched her husband being treated like a common violent criminal. The reality of their total destruction finally broke through her denial. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that made several guests flinch. "No, let him go!" Patricia shrieked, losing her mind completely. She lunged forward, her expensive silk gown dragging right through the spilled gravy and shattered crystal on the floor. She reached out, trying to grab the federal agent's arm, but another officer immediately stepped into her path, holding a firm hand up to block her advance. Denied access to her husband, Patricia whipped her head around. Her frantic, tear-streaked face locked onto me. She saw me standing there in my immaculate dress blue uniform, completely untouched by the chaos unfolding around me. "Paige, stop them!" Patricia begged, her voice raw and vibrating with pure panic. She clasped her hands together in a desperate, pleading motion. "You are a vice admiral. You have the power to call them off. Tell them this is all a terrible mistake. You are destroying our family, Paige. You are ruining everything we have built. Please, we are your blood." I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the weeping, hysterical woman who had stood silently by while my father threw me out onto the street 14 years ago. I thought about the years I had spent surviving on nothing, wondering why my own mother had not shed a single tear when I was cast out of this family. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the anger that had burned inside me for over a decade. I spoke with the icy, unwavering authority of a commander who had already won the war. "You destroyed this family 14 years ago when you let him throw me out," I told her, my words slicing through her hysteria with surgical precision. "You chose his money and his approval over your own daughter. I am not destroying anything today, Patricia. I am just cleaning up the mess." Patricia's knees buckled. The absolute finality in my voice stripped away her last remaining shred of hope. She collapsed right there onto the ruined gravy-stained floor, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. She finally realized that her perfect suburban life, her country club status, and her unearned financial security were evaporating right in front of her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Amidst the chaos of the federal raid, the shouting agents hauling Edward up from the table and my mother's pathetic weeping, I noticed a sudden quiet movement near the back of the room. It was Bradley, the golden child, the self-proclaimed apex predator, who had spent the entire day boasting about his elite tactical skills, was currently displaying the courage of a frightened mouse. While everyone else was entirely focused on Edward's dramatic arrest and Patricia's breakdown, Bradley was attempting to quietly, desperately slip away. He knew the financial records on the screen incriminated him just as much as his father. The hit and run, cover up the stolen inheritance, the illicit affairs, all of it was out in the open. He edged along the perimeter of the dining room, keeping his back pressed flat against the floral wallpaper to avoid drawing attention from the federal agents. He crept toward the heavy glass patio doors that led out to the dark, sprawling backyard gardens. He genuinely thought he could use the confusion to escape into the night and outrun the consequences of his stolen life. He reached out his hand, trembling violently, as he turned the brass handle and slid the heavy glass door open. He stepped out onto the cool limestone patio, letting out a shaky breath, thinking he had successfully evaded capture. But as soon as his boots hit the stone, two blindingly bright tactical flashlights snapped on from the darkness, hitting him directly in the face. Waiting for him on the patio were two massive, heavily armed military police officers. The heavy glass doors slid open with a sharp scrape as the two towering military police officers hauled my brother back into the dining room. Bradley was kicking and thrashing, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his military bearing. He looked like a panicked animal caught in a snare. "Let go of me," he demanded, his voice cracking wildly as he tried to dig his heels into the polished stone of the patio. "I am an active-duty Navy SEAL. I demand to speak to my commanding officer right now." The MP on his left, a man built like a brick wall, did not even blink. He simply tightened his iron grip on my brother's arm. "Your commanding officer is the one who signed the arrest warrant, sailor," the MP stated flatly, yanking Bradley forward. "You are under military arrest for possession of stolen federal assets, financial fraud, and conduct unbecoming. Keep your mouth shut and walk." They forced Bradley into the dining room, pushing him to his knees right next to the wreckage of the Thanksgiving table. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He saw the state senators and defense contractors staring at him with undisguised pity and disgust. He saw our father Edward pinned against the table in handcuffs, his face smeared with gravy and wine. Then Bradley's desperate gaze landed on his wife. Imani stepped forward. The brilliant corporate attorney moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen inspecting a ruined battlefield. She stepped smoothly over the shattered crystal and the spilled food, her dark maroon dress completely unblemished by the chaos surrounding her. She stopped directly in front of the man she had married, looking down at him with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. "Imani, you have to fix this." Bradley pleaded, his arrogant facade entirely gone. He was practically sobbing, straining against the heavy zip ties binding his wrists. "You are a lawyer. You know these people. Tell them they cannot do this to me. Tell them I did not know where the money came from. Get me out of these cuffs." Imani did not raise her voice. She did not yell or display a single ounce of the frantic, hysterical energy consuming my family. She simply reached down to her left hand. With a smooth, practiced motion, she twisted the heavy, expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She held the sparkling diamond between her thumb and forefinger for a fraction of a second, letting the flashing red and blue police lights from the window reflect off its facets. Then she reached forward and casually dropped the ring straight into the front breast pocket of Bradley's stained dress uniform. "I filed for divorce this morning," Imani said, her voice cutting through the noise of the room with razor-sharp precision. "And I am taking the house. It was bought with stolen funds anyway, and the federal government is going to seize it. Good luck explaining your lavish lifestyle to the military tribunal." Bradley stared down at the ring resting in his pocket, his jaw dropping open. The last pillar of his comfortable, unearned life had just been kicked out from under him. I was completely alone, stripped of his wealth, his marriage, and his false honor in a matter of seconds. Imani did not wait for his response. She turned her back on him, leaving him kneeling in the mess of his own making. She walked smoothly across the room until she was standing shoulder to shoulder with me. We stood there together, an impenetrable wall of female solidarity. Two women who had been treated as outsiders in this toxic family, now watching as the men who had tried to control our lives were completely dismantled by the very systems they thought they could manipulate. Imani looked at me, a slight, highly satisfied smile playing on her lips. "You throw a wonderful holiday party, Admiral," she whispered so only I could hear. I kept my eyes on the federal agent securing the room. "Thank you, Counselor," I replied quietly. I think the entertainment really brought the room together. The lead federal agent grabbed Edward by the bicep, hauling him up from the floor. My father was a pathetic, broken sight. His custom tuxedo was ruined. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and erratic. He refused to look at the powerful guests he had invited to witness his triumph. The elite politicians and retired generals parted like the Red Sea, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid any association with him as the agents marched him toward the grand foyer. The MPs hauled Bradley to his feet, marching him right behind our father. The Golden Child and the Patriarch paraded through their own mansion in handcuffs, their entire empire of arrogance reduced to a spectacular public humiliation. Patricia remained on the floor in the kitchen doorway, weeping loudly, completely ignored by the men she had spent her life defending. I fell into step behind the agents, with Imani walking right beside me. We followed the procession out of the dining room, through the lavishly decorated hallways, and out the front doors onto the sprawling circular driveway. The cool California night air hit my face, a refreshing contrast to the suffocating tension inside the house. A fleet of federal vehicles and military police cruisers sat idling in the driveway. The flashing emergency lights painted the exterior of the mansion in harsh, chaotic colors. Neighbors from the surrounding luxury estates had stepped out onto their lawns, wrapping their coats tightly around themselves, watching in absolute shock as the neighborhood's loudest, most arrogant resident was led out in disgrace. An agent opened the heavy back door of a heavily armored black cruiser, preparing to shove my father into the back seat. Edward stopped. He planted his expensive leather shoes against the pavement, resisting the agent's grip just long enough to turn his head and glare back at me. He was standing on the precipice of losing his freedom, his wealth, and his reputation, but his massive, fragile ego demanded one final desperate swing. He looked at me standing on the top step of his grand porch, flanked by the brilliant attorney who had audited his crimes. He bared his teeth, his face twisting into an ugly, hateful snarl. "You are nothing without my name!" Edward screamed over the low hum of the idling police cruisers, his voice ragged and desperate. "You hear me, Paige? You are a dropout. You are nothing but a bitter little girl, and you will always be nothing without me." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at the pathetic, ruined man from my position at the top of the stairs. I reached up and slowly, deliberately brushed my fingers against the 3 silver stars pinned to the collar of my dress uniform. "My name has 3 stars attached to it." "Edward," I replied, my voice echoing over the driveway with the cold, absolute authority of a military commander. "Yours has an inmate number. Have a happy Thanksgiving." The federal holding facility in downtown San Diego was a brutal contrast to the sprawling luxury of the La Jolla mansion. There were no crystal chandeliers here. There were no imported marble floors or catering staff carrying trays of expensive champagne. There was only the harsh, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights, the sterile smell of industrial bleach, and the heavy, unforgiving sound of steel doors locking shut. Less than 12 hours had passed since the raid ruined his Thanksgiving spectacle, but Edward had already demanded to see me. According to the federal agents, he had spent the entire night pacing his holding cell, shouting at the guards and demanding his phone so he could call his lawyers and politicians. He genuinely believed that the arrest was just a dramatic negotiating tactic. He thought that because we shared the same blood, he still held some invisible leverage over me. He assumed I would walk into that facility ready to barter. I arrived at the facility just after 9 in the morning. I did not come in civilian clothes. I wore my full dress blue uniform, every ribbon perfectly aligned, the 3 silver stars gleaming on my collar. When I walked through the heavily fortified entrance, the federal guards immediately stood at attention. They did not see a daughter visiting her disgraced father. They saw a high-ranking military commander handling a matter of national security. A guard escorted me down a long gray corridor and unlocked the heavy metal door to interrogation room 4. I stepped inside. Edward was sitting at a scarred aluminum table, his hands cuffed and chained to a steel ring bolted to the floor. They had stripped him of his ruined custom tuxedo. He was wearing a stiff, bright orange detention jumpsuit that swallowed his frame. Without his expensive suit, his manicured setting, and his sycophantic audience, he looked remarkably small. When he saw me enter, a fleeting spark of his old arrogance flared in his eyes. He tried to sit up straighter, attempting to project the authority of a CEO presiding over a boardroom. "Paige," he said, his voice raspy, but laced with a desperate manufactured warmth. "I knew you would come. You made your point last night. It was quite the show. You proved you have power, and I respect that. Now tell these agents to unhook me from this table so we can get down to business and figure out how to clean up this public relations nightmare." I did not sit down. I stood on the opposite side of the aluminum table, looking down at him with the clinical, detached observation of a scientist studying a harmless insect. "There is no public relations nightmare to clean up," Edward Frey stated, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any familial emotion. "The press already has the full story. The stock price of your logistics company plummeted to zero when the markets opened an hour ago. Your assets are frozen. Your mansion is being seized by the federal government to pay back the victims of your fraud. You do not have a business anymore." Edward swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The forced warmth vanished from his face, replaced by a creeping, suffocating panic. "Paige, listen to me," he pleaded, leaning forward as far as the steel chain would allow. "You cannot do this. I am your father. I gave you life. You cannot just let me rot in a concrete box for the rest of my days. We are blood. You have the power to make this go away. Tell them I did not know about the counterfeit chips. Tell them it was a vendor error. I will give you whatever you want." I reached into the interior pocket of my uniform jacket. I pulled out a single neatly folded document and dropped it onto the aluminum table. I pushed it slowly across the metal surface until it rested right in front of his cuffed hands. Next to the document, I placed a cheap black pen. "That is a federal confession form," I explained calmly. "It outlines your full admission to financial fraud, the forgery of my grandfather's trust, and the deliberate purchase and distribution of counterfeit compromised microchips to the United States military. It states that you acted alone and with full knowledge of the risks to active duty personnel." Edward stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison. "I am not signing that," he hissed, shaking his head rapidly. "If I sign that I spend the rest of my life in federal prison, I will take my chances with a jury. I will hire the best defense team in the country." "You have no money to hire a defense team," I reminded him smoothly. "But I will offer you a choice, Edward. Sign that confession right now, admit to every single charge, and I will personally speak to the federal prosecutor. I will make sure you are assigned to a minimum security white-collar facility. You will have a bed, 3 meals a day, and a yard to walk in." I leaned forward slightly, resting my knuckles on the table, closing the distance between us. "Refuse to sign it," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous command, "and I will take this case out of civilian hands entirely. Because your counterfeit hardware was installed in naval special warfare equipment. I have the authority to classify your actions as a direct attack on military infrastructure. I will have you transferred to military custody by noon. You will face a military tribunal for treason and for actively endangering the lives of deployed personnel." "There is no bail in a military tribunal, Edward. There are no fancy civilian lawyers to twist the facts. You will go to Leavenworth and you will never see the sky without razor wire in front of it again." Edward stopped breathing. The reality of his absolute lack of power crashed down on him with the weight of an anvil. He looked into my eyes, searching desperately for a shred of hesitation, a hint of the frightened, obedient daughter he used to bully. He found absolutely nothing. There was no mercy left in me for the man sitting across the table. His shoulders slumped forward. The rigid, arrogant posture he had maintained for his entire life completely collapsed. He let out a ragged, defeated breath that sounded like a dry sob. With trembling fingers, he reached out and picked up the cheap black pen. His hands shook so violently, he could barely press the ink to the paper. He dragged the pen across the signature line, signing away his empire, his freedom, and his pride in one shaky, illegible scrawl. He dropped the pen. It rolled off the table and clattered onto the concrete floor. He did not look up at me. He just stared at his chained hands, his spirit completely and totally broken. He finally understood that he was nothing more than a prisoner, and I was the one holding the keys. I picked up the signed confession, folded it precisely, and slipped it back into my uniform pocket. I did not offer a goodbye. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy steel door. As I reached for the handle, my secure phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from General Mitchell. "The disciplinary board is convened," the message read. "We are ready for your brother." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression of absolute victory. Edward was handled. Now it was time to strip the golden child of his precious trident. The drive back to the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado took less than 20 minutes, but felt like a journey across a lifetime. Just a few days ago, I had walked onto this base as the family disgrace and unwanted guest, forced to sit in the cheap plastic chairs at the back of the bleachers. Today, I was returning as the executioner. My driver pulled the government-issued vehicle right up to the administrative headquarters. I stepped out into the bright California sun, adjusting the cuffs of my dress uniform. The base was quiet now, stripped of the celebratory crowds and the marching bands. There was only the harsh reality of military justice waiting inside. I was escorted down a long, polished corridor to a secure hearing room. Two armed sentries stood outside the heavy oak doors. They snapped to attention and opened them for me. The room was stark and windowless, dominated by a long mahogany table. At the center sat General Mitchell, flanked by three senior Naval Special Warfare commanders. They looked like a firing squad carved from granite. Sitting alone at a small, sterile table facing them was my brother. Bradley looked entirely broken. The pristine dress white uniform he had worn like a superhero cape just days ago now looked like a costume that was 2 sizes too big for him. His posture had completely collapsed. His shoulders were slumped, his head hung low, and his hands were trembling violently in his lap. The golden child was finally facing a room full of people he could not bully or intimidate. I walked in silently, taking a seat in a leather chair positioned slightly behind the disciplinary board. Bradley flinched when he heard my footsteps, but he did not dare turn around to look at me. "Sailor General Mitchell," began, his voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "This board has reviewed the forensic financial evidence provided by federal authorities. We have reviewed the court documents regarding a severe hit-and-run incident that was unlawfully concealed. We have also reviewed the extensive financial records demonstrating that your lifestyle, your legal defenses, and your personal assets were entirely funded by stolen capital." Bradley kept his eyes glued to the mahogany table. He looked like he was going to be sick. "You stood on my parade deck and accepted one of the highest honors this military can bestow," General Mitchell continued, his tone growing dangerously sharp. "The seal trident is a symbol of absolute integrity. It represents a man who will sacrifice everything for his teammates and his country. You represent nothing but fraud. You bought your way out of federal prison using money your father stole from your own sister. You bring profound disgrace to the United States Navy and to every man who has bled for that pin." The silence in the room was absolute. Bradley let out a shaky breath that sounded like a whimper. "By the authority vested in me," General Mitchell declared, "I am formally stripping you of your special warfare designation. You are no longer a Navy SEAL. You are hereby discharged from this program, and you will remain in military custody pending the outcome of the federal investigations into your consumption of stolen assets. Remove your trident." Bradley froze. Tears welled up in his bloodshot eyes and began spilling down his cheeks. He reached up with a shaking hand, clutching the gold eagle pinned to his chest. It was the only thing that gave him an identity, the only thing that made him feel superior to the rest of the world. "Remove it, sailor," the general barked, slamming his hand flat against the table. With a ragged sob, Bradley unclasped the pin. He pulled the gold medal from his uniform and placed it slowly onto the wood of his table. The soft clink of the metal hitting the surface signaled the absolute death of his false empire. General Mitchell and the senior commanders stood up. They gathered their folders and marched out of the room without giving Bradley a second glance. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving just the two of us alone in the sterile room. Bradley stared at the gold pins sitting on the table. Then he finally turned around to look at me. His face was red and wet with tears. His expression twisted into a pathetic mask of pure victimhood. "Are you happy now, Paige?" he cried, his voice cracking with hysterical self-pity. "You took the only thing I ever worked for. I passed Hell Week. I did the physical training. I earned that pin with my own sweat, and you just walked in here and ripped it away from me because you have always been jealous. You set me up. You ruined my entire life because you could not stand watching me win." I did not raise my voice. I did not show him a single ounce of anger. I stood up from my leather chair and walked slowly toward his small table. I stopped right next to him. I lowered myself down, bending one knee until my face was perfectly level with his. I looked directly into his red, weeping eyes. "You did not earn anything, Brad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and razor sharp. "You drove a woman and her child off the road and ran away like a coward. You let our father steal my future to buy your freedom. You spent years calling me a failure while using my money to pay your gambling debts and fund your arrogant lifestyle." He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly as if he could block out the truth of my words. "You were handed the world on a silver platter, Brad," I told him, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "And you still choked. I was given absolutely nothing, and I own the board." I stood back up, smoothing my uniform jacket. I did not wait for him to respond. There was nothing left for him to say. I turned my back on my brother and walked out of the hearing room, leaving him to weep alone over the gold pin he never deserved to wear. I stepped out of the headquarters building and inhaled a deep breath of the fresh ocean air. The California sun felt warm and revitalizing on my skin. The suffocating weight of my toxic family was finally lifting. I had dismantled the men who had tormented me for over a decade. As I walked toward my waiting vehicle, my secure burner phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, checking the screen. It was an unknown number, but I instantly recognized the local area code. I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear. Paige, a voice gasped frantically through the speaker. It was Patricia. My mother sounded completely unhinged, her voice rising in absolute blind panic. "Paige, you have to help me." The federal agents locked the gates to the mansion. I went to the grocery store and every single one of my credit cards was declined. The bank teller told me all the accounts are frozen. "I do not have a dollar to my name, Paige. I have nowhere to go. You have to send me money right now." The neon sign of the roadside diner buzzed erratically against the gray afternoon sky, casting a sickly flickering light over the cracked asphalt parking lot. It was a cheap, rundown establishment miles away from the affluent neighborhoods of La Jolla. It was a place where the coffee was burned, the vinyl booths were patched with duct tape, and the clientele preferred to be left alone. It was an absolute world away from the Michelin-starred restaurants and exclusive country clubs my mother used to frequent. I pulled my unmarked government vehicle into a space near the back. I wore a simple black trench coat over my uniform, keeping a low profile. I stepped out of the car, feeling the chill of the coastal wind against my face, and walked through the glass doors. The heavy smell of stale grease and industrial floor cleaner hit me instantly. I spotted her immediately in a dark corner booth. Patricia looked entirely stripped of her manufactured glamour. Her expensive blonde hair was flat, the dark roots clearly visible at her scalp. Her designer silk blouse was severely wrinkled, and the heavy, ostentatious diamond jewelry she used to flaunt constantly was completely gone, seized by federal agents during the asset forfeiture process. Without the shield of Edward's stolen money, she looked remarkably small, fragile, and terrified. I walked over and slid into the booth across from her. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about my new command or the incredible events of the past week. She wrapped her shaking hands around a thick ceramic coffee mug and immediately launched into a frantic, tearful monologue. "Paige, it has been an absolute nightmare," Patricia cried, her voice trembling with self-pity. "The federal agents literally locked the gates to the mansion. I had to leave with nothing but a single suitcase. I went to the grocery store the next morning, and every single one of my credit cards was declined at the register. The bank teller looked at me like I was a criminal. She told me all the accounts are frozen indefinitely. I had to sleep on a terrible, stiff mattress in a cheap motel last night because my friends from the club will not even answer my phone calls. I do not have a dollar to my name page. I have nowhere to go. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the sticky laminate surface of the table. I watched the woman who had happily lived a life of absolute luxury, funded by my stolen inheritance. She was painting herself as the ultimate victim of a tragedy she claimed she had no part in creating. Then her tone shifted. The desperate weeping mother act hardened into that familiar toxic entitlement I knew so well. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide and demanding. "You have to fix this, Paige," she insisted, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Edward and Bradley are facing years in federal prison. They are ruined, and they left me with absolutely nothing. You are the only one left. You are a vice admiral. You have a massive government salary, and the lawyers said you are getting all your grandfather's trust fund money back. I need you to buy me a condo in downtown San Diego. Nothing overly extravagant, just a nice secure two-bedroom high-rise. And I will need a monthly allowance to cover my living expenses until this horrible scandal blows over." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer depth of her delusion. She actually believed she was entitled to the very money her husband had stolen from me. She expected me to fund her lifestyle simply because her original financial host had been locked in a federal holding cell. "I am your mother," Patricia pressed, misinterpreting my silence as hesitation. "I gave birth to you. I raised you. You owe me this, Paige. You cannot just leave your own mother out on the street to suffer for Edward's mistakes." I let her finish her frantic, pathetic demands. I looked at the cold, bitter woman sitting across from me, and I realized I felt no anger. I felt no resentment. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional hold she once had over me had been completely severed the moment I watched her try to command me to hide in the back row at Coronado. "I am not buying you a condo, Patricia." I stated, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "I am not giving you a monthly allowance. I am not giving you a single cent." Patricia gasped, her eyes widening in genuine shock. Her face flushed a dark, angry red. "Paige, how can you be so cruel? I am destitute. I have never worked a day in my life. How am I supposed to survive?" "You will survive the same way I did when you let Edward throw me out of the house 14 years ago," I replied smoothly. "You will figure it out." I leaned forward slightly, making sure she heard every single syllable with absolute clarity. "You stood by while they stole my entire future to fund your luxury vacations. You happily spent the money my grandfather left me while pretending I did not exist. You watched them humiliate me time and time again, and you never once raised your voice to stop them. You handed me a cheap plastic ticket just days ago and told me to hide my face so I would not ruin your perfect family aesthetic. You are not a victim, Patricia. You were an active participant in my destruction, and now you are facing the consequences of your own complicity." She opened her mouth, tears of fury spilling over her eyelashes, ready to scream and cause a public scene to manipulate me through guilt. I did not give her the chance. "You can get a job, Patricia," I told her, delivering the final, crushing reality check. "Welcome to the real world." I reached into the pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed it flat on the table right next to her ceramic coffee mug. "This covers the coffee," I said. I stood up, turned my back on her, and walked straight toward the exit. I did not look back. I did not listen to her calling my name from the booth. I pushed through the glass doors of the diner and stepped out into the cool, refreshing coastal air. As I walked across the parking lot to my vehicle, I pulled my secure smartphone from my pocket. I navigated to my contact list and found my mother's name. With one simple, deliberate tap of my thumb, I blocked her number permanently. I deleted her contact profile. The final toxic tie to my past was completely severed. I was finally truly free. I reached for the door handle of my car, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. Suddenly, my secure phone vibrated against my palm, with a distinct, rapid triple pulse alert. It was the highest priority emergency signal programmed into my classified device. I stopped and quickly unlocked the screen, authenticating my biometric signature. The message was marked urgent, sent directly from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. "Admiral," the message read, "Your presence is required in Washington immediately. A military transport is waiting for you at the airfield. The President of the United States is requesting a direct briefing in the Situation Room. 6 months later, the crisp morning air of Washington, D.C. felt entirely different from the stifling, toxic atmosphere of La Jolla. I stood on the bustling sidewalk of K Street, looking up at a gleaming glass office building. On the directory board by the elevators, a newly installed brass plaque caught the morning sunlight. It read, Vanguard Legal Defense and Corporate Accountability. I took the elevator to the 12th floor and pushed open the heavy glass doors. The reception area was immaculate, humming with the quiet, efficient energy of a top-tier law firm. Imani stood behind her massive marble conference table, reviewing a stack of legal documents. She wore a striking crimson suit, her natural hair styled in a flawless crown. She looked absolutely radiant. The heavy, exhausting shadow that Bradley had cast over her for years was completely gone. She was a woman operating at the absolute peak of her power, unburdened and unstoppable. We had spent the last several months untangling the massive, complicated web of my father's legal and financial ruin. Imani had been the primary architect of that destruction, and as a result, her reputation in the legal world had skyrocketed to unprecedented heights. When she decided to open her own independent law firm, I used my connections in the capital to help her secure the prime real estate and introduce her to the right network of federal prosecutors. She had finalized her divorce from Bradley with lethal efficiency. Because the property they lived in was purchased with stolen funds, it was seized by the government, but Imani walked away with her own assets perfectly protected. She left him with absolutely nothing but his impending military tribunal. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider as I walked into her office. We clinked our glasses together over the mahogany desk. To new empires, Imani said, her dark eyes shining with genuine joy. To tearing down the old ones, I replied, taking a sip. We stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Capitol. We did not need to talk about Bradley or Edward. Their names belonged in the past, buried under federal indictments and severe prison sentences. We were focused entirely on the future. Later that afternoon, I sat in my own secure office reviewing a digital file sent over by the Department of Justice. The asset forfeiture process following my father's arrest had been swift and merciless. The federal government had seized the La Jolla mansion, the luxury vehicles, and every remaining corporate account tied to his fraudulent logistics company. The properties were auctioned off to pay the massive fines he owed the government and the financial settlements for the victims of Bradley's hit and run. But before the government took its share, the courts recognized my primary claim. The $5 million that Edward had stolen from my grandfather's trust fund 10 years ago was fully recovered and transferred back into my name. I stared at the bank statement on my encrypted tablet. $5 million. It was a staggering amount of money, the exact sum that was supposed to secure my future when I was a struggling, discarded teenager. But looking at all those zeros, I realized I did not actually need a single cent of it. I had built my own financial security. I had earned my rank, my command, and my salary through my own blood, sweat, and absolute grit. I did not want Edward's tainted money sitting in my personal accounts. I wanted to transform that stolen legacy into a powerful weapon for good. I made a phone call to my financial team and instructed them to draft the foundational paperwork for a new initiative. I used the entire $5 million to establish a specialized cyber defense scholarship named in honor of the grandfather who had originally tried to protect me. The fund was designed specifically to pay the full university tuition for brilliant, underprivileged young women seeking degrees in advanced cybersecurity and digital intelligence. I wanted to find the girls who were being told they were not smart enough, the girls who were being pushed to the back row, the girls who were told they were failures by the very people supposed to protect them. I was going to hand those girls the resources to build their own invisible shields. Edward had stolen my grandfather's money to build a corrupt, fragile empire of arrogance. I was using that exact same money to build an army of brilliant women who would secure the future of the nation. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I approved the final transfers for the scholarship fund and locked my tablet. I adjusted the collar of my dress blue uniform, making sure the 3 silver stars were perfectly aligned. I stepped out of my transport vehicle and walked toward the massive, imposing entrance of the Pentagon. The mid-afternoon sun reflected off the pristine white stone of the building. As I walked through the high-security corridors, the atmosphere shifted around me. I was no longer the outcast daughter or the forgotten dropout. Junior officers stopped in their tracks, flattening themselves against the walls to make way for me. High-ranking commanders paused their conversations, snapping to rigid attention and throwing crisp, perfect salutes as I passed. I returned their salutes with practiced, effortless authority. I had walked through fire to earn this respect, and I wore it like impenetrable armor. I reached the secure checkpoint, leading to the deepest, most highly classified section of the building. The armed guards verified my biometric clearance and pulled open the heavy steel doors. I stepped into the central command hub, ready to oversee the global network that kept our forces alive. But before I could even reach my command desk, my secure communications unit chirped with a priority override alert. I pulled the device from my pocket. It was a direct message from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The text was brief, highly classified, and required immediate action. The President of the United States was requesting a direct briefing in the Situation Room. The ambient temperature in the National Military Command Center was kept at a freezing 68 degrees, but the air crackled with a suffocating electric intensity. I stood at the center of the subterranean secure facility, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the master tactical console. A massive digital map of the globe spanned the entire front wall of the room, illuminated by pulsing red threat vectors and cascading streams of encrypted data. Dozens of elite cyber warfare specialists sat at their stations around me, their fingers flying across keyboards as they monitored a massive coordinated digital assault attempting to breach the United States financial sector. It was a state-sponsored syndicate, highly funded and incredibly aggressive. They thought they had found a backdoor into the Federal Reserve Network. They had no idea they were walking directly into a digital kill box I had personally designed. I watched the red vectors inch closer to our outer firewalls. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Senior intelligence officers and defense strategists stood quietly in the shadows waiting for my command. I did not sweat. I did not raise my voice. I operated in this high-stakes environment with the same cold, calculating precision I had used to dismantle the toxic empire of my own family. Hold the perimeter. I instructed, my voice projecting clearly across the vast command center. Let them bypass the outer shell. Draw them into the secondary server array. A young lieutenant looked up from his monitor, his face pale with adrenaline. Admiral, they are deploying a localized malware payload. If they breach the secondary array, they could trigger a massive data wipe. They are not going to breach it, I replied, my tone radiating absolute, unshakable authority. Because the secondary array is a mirror network. It is completely isolated from the mainframe. They are currently hacking a ghost. I looked at the lead tactical officer standing to my right. Reroute their payload back through their own proxy servers. Execute the countermeasure and burn their entire network to the ground. The room erupted into a flurry of focused lethal action. Within seconds, the pulsing red threat vectors on the global map froze, flickered, and then violently shattered into harmless fragments of green code. A cheer went up from the intelligence officers. We had not just stopped the attack. We had traced the syndicate back to their origin point and permanently neutralized their operating capacity. I stood perfectly still, watching the green confirmation screens light up the dark room. When I spoke, men and women who had spent decades in the armed forces listened with absolute reverence. I was respected. I was feared. I was fiercely and undeniably independent. The scared, isolated girl, who had been handed a back row ticket